Hello, everyone, and welcome to Political Frenemies. And I do indeed believe that this is episode 10 of Political Frenemies. So we're making it into double figures, which makes it makes us really happy, and hopefully you as well, our wonderful viewers and listeners. Yep. So welcome. This is the podcast where two friends who hold often really quite different political views discuss the issues and the politics of the week, but still remain friends, and that is the key. So I'm Mathew Hulbert. I'm a Lib Dem activist and a former councillor for the party. And the guy just over there is Dr. Chris Newton. He is an academic, and the last time that the Tories were in opposition, he advised them on defence policy matters. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Mathew. Yes, good to be here. Glad that it's episode 10. Now, I should say from the off, I've been a little bit unwell over the past week. I had a cold, and I might feel a little bit blocked. I might sniffle a little bit. So I thought I'd say straight away, if I do that during the course of this broadcast, then I do apologise. But now, I'm over the worst of it, so we can.
Oh, good. Well, good. And we're pleased to hear that. But is this man flu or is this actual flu?
It's always man flu, isn't it? It's always it's always the worst thing possible. So yeah, I want lots of sympathy. I want sympathy cards. I want emails. I've been feeling it this week, so I deserve a bit of love.
Well, indeed. So are you having Lemsip and all of that? Or what are you doing?
I've just paracetamol, and I have sort of lemon in hot water. And so, yeah, I don't usually take anything more stronger than that. But yeah, that's my what I've been effectively sort of drinking and downing sort of for the past few days. So yeah.
Well, we hope you're back to full strength soon, and we're really pleased that we're both here. It might not be a long one, this one, but it's a really interesting topic. Obviously, people will know that. Well, on the day of recording this yesterday, it was that obviously there was the emergency recall of Parliament to talk all about British steel. And we can get into all of the politics of that as we're going to, but obviously it's a really big issue that is mostly domestic but has an international element to it as well. So another big week, Chris.
Yeah, another really big week, pretty historic in the sense that there was a Saturday sitting, and the government and Parliament had to sit to debate and pass this emergency legislation, and it's a real big week, and the implications of this is massive, in terms of the risk to our ability to make steel, and also the implications for industrial policy moving forward. Will this strengthen the case for nationalisation even further? And what does this mean in terms of the government's relationship with industry as well?
There was some debate, wasn't there, about whether this was the most recent recall of Parliament, because sometimes there has been sessions on a Saturday. So, for example, I think when the Queen Mother died, and also I think during the EU debates, but whether they were recalls or not has been debated.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, any sitting on a weekend is unusual, and is something that we need to take notice of. And so and as we indicated, it's the implications of this is huge. So what do you make of this? What do you make of the government's handling, and how did we get to this point where the government is passing emergency legislation to effectively direct the British Steel Company, although it's a Chinese-owned steel company. What do you make of this, and how has the government performed over the past few days?
Well, I'm just going to be upfront now that I don't pretend to be an expert on British Steel, so I can only go on what I've seen on watching the debate, and I watched pretty much all of the debate in the Commons and some of the debate in the Lords, and it was really interesting from a party political perspective, and we can get into that shortly. But even so, even from kind of a layman's perspective, it seemed that there was quite a bit of debate, certainly between the two main front benches, the government and the Tory opposition, about how far back this issue went, and whether the previous government had attempted to sort it out and do some kind of deal. The government claiming that actually they came into a situation where there was nothing set up or organised that they could follow up on. The Tories saying that there was. So there was a bit of political argy-bargy about that. But I mean, it's interesting that why it was ever why a Chinese company was ever allowed to buy it in the first place. I mean, I would have assumed, and again, this is absolutely from a layman's position, that I would have assumed, and I'm sure I did assume up until this week, that British Steel was a British company and that it was run by Brits. I had no idea, to be honest with you, Chris, that it was run by a Chinese company, and that to me sounds odd in the first place. I mean, I don't know if you know more about that, but that to me, for a start off, seems an odd position to be in.
I'm definitely, I would agree with that, and it represents, I think, and I'm really sort of angry about this, because obviously steel is a major resource that we need in this country to build all various things. But as a defence expert, steel is important, and I think the domestic manufacture of steel, even though we do import a lot of steel for defence, I think especially now in the current geostrategic environment, is important that that we think more about domestic production of steel. But it's quite remarkable that I think it was under Boris Johnson that that the steel plant in Scunthorpe was and British steel manufacturing was sold to this Chinese company. Now the government then said that there weren't any bidders, weren't any other kind of viable other bidders, and that's why I went to this company. But it represents multiple failures of establishment policies, I think, and this is why I'm especially angry. The naivety over China is one of them, and the fact that China is a rival, and I know that governments haven't necessarily seen this, but China is a rival, China is a threat, and this whole incident illustrates the vulnerability of what can happen if you place a vital strategic resource in under control of a company, essentially of a hostile power. It also represents the failure of successive governments, Conservative and Labour, to think grand strategically and to link economic security with national security, and to really think about what assets need to be protected. And I will have to say this, and you'll probably have something strong to say about this, but I really do think that it represents the sheer lunacy of both governments' net zero policy, and the fact that the that steel manufacturing and this company didn't become viable. A big reason for this was because of the rising costs of energy, and the rising costs of coal, of acquiring coking coal as well, and this sheer idiocy of closing the Cumbrian, or the government withdrawing from the Cumbrian coking coal plant, and for us to transport our coal from Japan instead. I mean, how on earth is that firstly sensible, but also environmentally friendly? I don't know, but the sheer cost of energy is a big factor, and of course Trump's tariffs as well played a part as well. But surely we need to abandon net zero, because it's making industry and manufacturing in this country extremely difficult.
So, if I might say, Chris, with respect, you sound rather reform-esque with your criticism of net zero. I mean, I guess what I'd say on that, and what I'd ask you in return on that, is that
I think I sound common sense-esque.
is that climate change is real. I don't think you'd deny that. That it is man-made. I hope you wouldn't deny that either, and that therefore governments have to have a policy on that. And I hope you wouldn't also deny, perhaps you would, but I hope you also wouldn't deny that therefore we not only need a policy, but we need to be investing in green energy. And I don't think you have to be in party political terms an actual green to believe that should be the case. And I mean, what I'd really hope is that all the parties, or at least all the parties, perhaps from the likes of Reform, agree on net zero, and agree that this is important. So are you being Trumpian on all of this, Chris?
I don't think so. I think it's a question of priorities, and on the science of climate change, I'm not an expert, right? I'm not going to talk in depth about the science. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure whether YouTube will allow us anyway. But
the
in
science is
terms,
settled, is it not? The science is settled
well,
on climate change.
there are lots of scientists that that adhere to the prevailing wisdom on that, but there are also other scientists that question that. And as an open-minded academic, I'm open to hearing to hearing all views. But I do think it's a question of priorities here. And again, it's on the specific point, I don't see how it helps climate change to import key materials from the other side of the world when we can just transport it over the road, down the road from Cumbria or wherever the raw materials are. I mean that just doesn't make sense. But also, what's important and what's increasingly what's going to take priority, I think, over climate change, is our ability to make things, and in particular from a defense point of view, our ability to manufacture weapon systems and so forth. It's also, energy costs is going to be a major political issue as well, and energy poverty is going to be a significant issue, and is already becoming a major issue with the winter fuel payments for pensioners being withdrawn, and so forth. And given that we only produce 1% of the world's carbon, then we have to take a realistic and look at all of this, and to state, yes, I mean, I think the strongest case for environmental policy is clean air, and to make the air clean. But the problem is that we don't live in a perfect world. New forms of energy, new forms of technology haven't come on stream to replace the old forms yet, and therefore you still need a viable country that's running and functioning, and so forth.
Chris,
and for the moment, we still need
yeah.
to prioritize those traditional forms of energy.
But Chris, don't you think that? So I agree with you to an extent, but don't you think that is because we've not been anywhere near ambitious enough in terms of bringing these new forms of cleaner and greener energy into being? That the successive governments have, certainly in my opinion, been far too timid on this, and that we need to be acting further and faster to bring these things on board and online. Because the climate change is not going away. The planet is heating up. Certainly, in my, I hear what you say about being open-minded to all views, but actually, my view is that the science is the science that's worth listening to, and the scientists that are worth listening to are the science is settled on this. The planet is heating up. We are seeing climate change. It is overwhelmingly man-made, and we need policies that are going to not just over the long term, or not even over the long term, but far quicker than that, need to be doing all we can to mitigate that issue.
But given that, I mean, the Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary today, still couldn't guarantee that effectively they've got enough raw materials to keep the blast furnaces going, and there have been negotiations over electric arc furnaces, which is the clean, the newer form of steel means of steel manufacturing. But given, given what Jonathan Reynolds said today, and the fact that steel making is under threat, we risk losing our domestic steel capability. Then the priority at the moment, the priority here in the here and now, surely has to be to keep that running, and to keep our industry, and to keep our country competitive in terms of industry. And you don't do that by having massive energy costs in comparison with the rest of the developed world.
And I don't disagree, and I think the government has done the right thing and has done what it needed to do. In actual fact, and I mean, I'm interested to see, Chris, whether you agree with this or not, but I thought yesterday was one of the better days that the government has had since it came into office. I mean, it was doing something. You may say that it could have acted before now, and indeed that the previous government could have acted, but ultimately, this was the government standing up for British Steel, and I heard various vox pops yesterday of people in that locality being interviewed, and pretty much overwhelmingly, the people seem to be welcoming the fact that this was happening, and perhaps no surprise in that, but people were recognising that the government were acting on their behalf. So I thought yesterday was a good day for the government. I think the main criticism, though, and I there seemed to be no answer from Jonathan Reynolds, who actually I think is one of the better ministers in this Labour government. And I've occasionally, this was pre him being in government, but I've occasionally kind of tweeted him, and he'd quite often reply, and seems like a good person and a competent person. But he didn't seem to be able to answer the points from the Scottish and Welsh MPs, so from the SNP and Plaid, so obviously opposition MPs, but about why action hasn't been taken in Grangemouth in terms of Scotland, and Port Talbot in terms of Wales, and I think the accusation can be made that the government has suddenly taken action in regards to these plants in England, but doesn't seem, obviously Port Talbot is now a past issue because that that's all closed down from what I gather. But I mean, our Lib Dem MP David Chadwick, our Welsh Lib Dem MP, raised this point in the Commons yesterday, and the government seemed to have no answer. So I mean, I think this does seem that they're preoccupied in regards to England, but not about anywhere else. I don't know if that's a fair accusation, Chris, or not.
Well, it could be that this is the last one, and they've only got their act together when it's almost said and done, and essentially. And I think, I mean, yes, the government has been able to present itself as acting decisively and so forth, and you could argue that it's had it's had something positive to say, and it's had a good PR day, but I don't really see it myself. I mean, this issue was, I mean, I think the closure was announced was it the 27th of March or something? This issue had been, excuse me, this issue had been, had been debated, argued about during the course of the week. You had Reform going up early in the week to Scunthorpe, and Farage made his pitch. And, he talked about nationalisation, which I'm sure we'll come to in a minute. And what was Starmer doing early in the week? He was talking about theme parks, and they only really acted on this until right at the last minute. So is this really a,
but
did
just
they
on
really
that,
act?
I mean, just on that, yes, it may have been in response to what Reform were doing. But just on Reform, and this is where I have a really strong opinion. You won't be surprised to learn, Chris, that Richard Tice, Reform deputy leader, sat there with a trade union Save British Steel badge on. I mean, give me a break. Reform vote against workers' rights every opportunity that they can get. I'm just not going to take this from them. I mean, they obviously, think that it's a popular position to have, and it may well be. I rather in the way that a stop clock is right twice a day. I think that the view that they're at least espousing, whether they really believe it or not, is a different matter. But the view that they're espousing that British Steel should be nationalised, I agree with. I think it absolutely should be in the public's hands. But the idea that Nigel Farage and Richard Tice care one jot about the rights of workers. Where's the evidence of that? They vote against workers' rights every chance they get.
Well, I don't know what their voting record is on specific pieces of legislation, but in terms of being attuned to the political mood, I think Reform has been ahead of everyone, haven't they? They were ahead of Labour. Where were the Lib Dems early in the week? I didn't really hear much of them. So you might have your complaints about Reform, but they're really good at identifying an issue, latching onto it very quickly, and their PR game is very good. Regardless of what you might think of them, they're very good at making noise like this. Whereas all of the other parties do seem to have acted a bit not necessarily slow, but certainly slower on this. Whilst early in the week they were up in Scunthorpe and they were making a big fanfare.
But do you think that they really care about workers' rights reform?
I think they do. They do care about working class people. I think the fact that they have been voicing many of the concerns of the working classes, whether it's through Brexit, whether it's through immigration. They certainly do have a political, their political nous for identifying with the concerns of what working class people people advocate. In terms of their views on workers' rights and their policies on workers' rights, we'll see what their policies are when they develop them. I know that they take they want to balance more between kind of the abilities of the business owner, especially in terms of hiring and firing and so forth. But we'll have to see what their sort of industry and workers' rights policy is when they develop it. But they do. But I think they, out of all of the parties, they do talk about the issues that many working class voters care about, which is why they're doing very well in that constituency, why they're making waves in the red wall, and why their polling is very good, and why their polling is better than the Lib Dems.
Well, for the moment. And I mean, and another point, and a point I agree on with that my party leader and Ed Davey and also Daisy Cooper, our Treasury spokesperson, made in the Commons yesterday. when they made the point that, and actually this goes for both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, that people who were cheerleaders for Donald Trump owe an apology to the likes of British Steel and others, given what Trump is doing to the global economy with these tariffs. Even after the pause, I mean, it's called a pause, but in actual fact, there's still the tariff baseline of 10%,
Still
which,
10%.
as we discussed previously, is still going to, even you may say that it's better than higher tariffs, and indeed it is, but it's still going to have an impact on jobs and on businesses and on employees and all the rest of it. So I think the likes of Badenoch and Farage and Tice need to be apologising for their role in cheerleading for Trump before they start trying to pretend that they care about British Steel and British workers.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, Trump is a factor. The tariffs are a factor, but energy costs have been rising considerably especially over the course of the last few years, especially due to the impact of the war in Ukraine. But certainly Trump hasn't helped, and yes, I think supporters of Trump, and I wasn't really one of them. I said what I thought were in earlier episodes what were good points about Trump and what were bad points about Trump, and the further we get through this presidency, the more bad points I have to say about him. But yes, that's certainly a factor. You mentioned Badenoch, and I think you had some things to say about her on social media. What do you make of the Tories' response, or indeed, did they make any kind of headway or impact in relation to this issue?
Well, I mean, I think Badenoch made herself look pretty foolish, actually, because Jonathan Reynolds seemed pretty sure of his ground, and ultimately he's the one, in government. He seemed pretty sure of his ground that according to him, at least, no attempted deal by the Tories had been left. And Badenoch didn't seem to be able to provide the details of what her alleged deal had, draft deal had been.
I saw that exchange, and a lot of people dunked on it, and I didn't see it that way. To be honest, she made a perfectly sort of reasonable point, saying that there were negotiations. They were negotiating something. Whether or not a bare bones of a deal was on paper. I assume that there might have been, because if you're negotiating, obviously you're writing down what the potential deal is. And she said that obviously it wasn't a final deal, it wasn't an agreed deal, and it wasn't an agreed deal because Sunak called a snap election. They were in the middle of negotiating when Sunak, just before Sunak called that election, and then everybody said afterwards, oh, she wasn't clear, or she didn't come up with the details. Firstly, she wasn't making a statement, she was intervening on Jonathan Reynolds. It was the shadow business secretary who ultimately responded, Andrew Griffith. And secondly, well, of course she couldn't produce the detail at that point because she was in the chamber debating. But I thought obviously we need to see the detail of what they were negotiating, and hopefully that will come out over time. But I thought there and then it wasn't quite the disastrous, foolish statement that you and others said it was.
Well, in which case, those details need to be produced, because I think if not, she'll have been made to look foolish. So, I think for her own reputation, she needs to provide some kind of evidence of what that deal was. And in terms of the Tory business spokesperson that you mentioned there, I mean, he's got some questions to answer too, because you talked about when the company was sold under, I believe, Boris Johnson. I think I'm right in saying that I heard Jonathan Reynolds say yesterday that the Tory spokesperson, I think Mr. Griffiths, had been an advisor to a business advisor to Boris Johnson during that time. So, you know, let's hear a bit more from him on what he was advising at that time.
One thing I do hope, I hope that the Business Select Committee will call Boris and will call whoever was involved in that decision to make that decision. I mean, that decision about selling it to Yingwei is extraordinary after we went through all of the business with Huawei and the digital communications and so forth. I just find it extraordinary that decision was made. But also Labour has questions to answer as well, because their policy on China is just as conciliatory. You know, in the sense that, you know, Starmer rushed to China to have that meeting with President Xi. You've got the whole business of the super embassy, and Labour's policy on China is it doesn't recognise, you know, given everything that China is doing at the moment, especially around Taiwan, surely it needs to be more robust.
Well, indeed, and Taiwan is absolutely an issue. And then also and I mean, this is separate, but obviously it's connected to China and the politics of China. That I'm sure you would have seen this, Chris, but that it's emerged that last week Lib Dem MP Vera Hobhouse attempted to go to China to see her newly born grandchild and wasn't able to enter the country, so this has become, and I think it'll grow into the week, you know, as we start the new week, that this will be quite a big issue, and we've seen David Lammy respond to that and say that it's very concerning. Lib Dems are calling for him to get the Chinese ambassador in to ask what on earth happened there.
I was going to ask, what has the Liberal Democrats said about China over the past year or so? Because Ed Davey has a lot to say about Trump, but I don't hear him talk about, and obviously Putin, but I don't really hear him talk a lot about China.
Look, I'm going to be absolutely honest here. I couldn't begin to tell you what our policy is on China. I mean, I'd expect, and I'd like to hope that you know, we're very concerned about China, and especially in regards to Taiwan, but I can't pretend to tell you what our policy is, because it's not something that regularly gets raised by the Lib Dems. I've certainly not heard it. So, but then again, you know, there's lots of trouble spots in the world that don't necessarily often get raised by parliamentarians of all parties. So, you know, we can bemoan that we're not more internationally focused, but I think that's just a truism of all parties. A bit different when you're in government and you do have to be across kind of everything that's going on in the world from a foreign policy perspective. But I don't think it's just the Lib Dems that don't necessarily raise China on a regular basis. Perhaps they should, and I think that's a fair criticism of all political parties. Actually, I mean, the different domestic responses were interesting. You know, I think the interesting thing was that, you know, the Tories didn't vote against this, so I think they recognised that this was needed. I just don't think they liked the way, you know, they thought this could have been dealt with before, rather than in this emergency sitting yesterday. And so, you know, I think that's a fair enough criticism from them.
What did you think of the
went strongly on the Trump aspect, you know, as I knew they would. The Greens called for nationalisation, as you'd expect them to do, and as I say on that, I agree with them. Just on nationalisation, then Chris, because actually, you know, I don't want to sound like an old lefty, but I'm of the view that public utilities should be in the public's hands, and actually I'm of the view that other things like water should be publicly owned, because actually I think, I'm not even necessarily saying that, you know, the government runs things better, because sometimes they don't, but I think there needs to be public accountability for public assets, and I think that can't possibly happen if they're owned by private companies. And so I think just on that kind of principled level, I support the nationalisation of some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, on the specifics of steel, it may very well be that we need, at least temporarily, to nationalise it, because there isn't a viable, there may not be a viable British alternative at this stage. And if that's the case, then I think that's better than selling it off to a rival or a threat. So yeah, I mean, I'm a conservative, right? And I think a lot of people on the right and the left can confuse conservatism with libertarianism. I've never identified with libertarianism or indeed full fat economic liberalism, because it is liberalism rather than conservatism, like it's proper economic liberalism of the kind that the Lib Dems don't believe in. But anyway, I'm on the tangent there. So I'm a national security person. I'm a defence person. So I do believe that there are industries, there's still been one of them, defence, another, and there may well be others as well, that needs at the very least protections and to keep within or at least some degree of protection, so that the government has some say over it, or can take over if necessary. I'm so in that sense. So in that sense, I'm not kind of full blown. Let's privatize, or let's have everything on the open international market. But at the same time, I probably prefer it to be to be government controlled of industry, as opposed to full blown nationalisation. I mean, people say that nationalisation is a solution here to steel and as you say, water and the railways and other things. But I've yet to hear an argument to say that, to convincingly say that, just by bringing it into the state, then things will naturally be more efficient and will be better.
But do you accept
history?
But do you accept the accountability point that it doesn't necessarily mean? I mean, I'd like to think that things would be run better, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. But what it does mean is that there's proper accountability, because ultimately, and unless we're going to constantly have things like we did yesterday of the government giving itself, or Parliament giving the government and the Secretary of State particular powers to intervene, then ultimately there's only so much the government can do when these public services and utilities are run by private companies. Is that not the case?
But you can say that, say if they put it in the hands of a Quango, right? You have the same issue, in the sense of accountability. There are lots of Quangos responsible for various things in government, and they're not accountable either.
But they should be accountable. I mean,
and also there's also there's another layer of accountability in terms of these kind of the private the contract with Yingwei and Steel, the water companies, the railways. Who's signing the contracts? Who's negotiating the contracts? Is yes, the company is responsible for running things badly, but often they're running it on the basis of contracts negotiated by civil servants who don't really understand industry, don't really have commercial expertise, and they haven't negotiated, hadn't done a good job in terms of devising a contract that places accountability and full regulations and so forth. This has often been the complaint with defence procurement, that the MOD is very bad, historically at negotiating contracts. So there is there is there is state failure even in a privatized sort of system as well. But I do get your point about accountability, and whatever system that you employ, whether it's nationalized system or whether it's a private system, if we can develop a mechanism by which there is direct accountability to a private company, or whether it's through a cooperative, or there's various different models that you can experiment
Yeah,
look at. But you're right about there should be more direct accountability. How you do that, that requires a lot of thought, and not something that I can put in a off the cuff 5 seconds remark.
and just on that, I mean, I'm personally a big fan of cooperatives and mutuals, and getting, workers representatives on boards and all the rest of that. I think that should become the norm across industry, really. But certainly when it comes to what are affect, public assets and public services. So I'd certainly like to see that that as an option.
But
And obviously the government is made up of Labour and cooperative members of Parliament. So I mean, I'm sure that'll be something that many Labour MPs are advocating for. Just in the final few minutes that we have, Chris, I mean, the government wouldn't go as far as nationalisation yesterday, but don't you think, in regards to this, that is inevitable, at least for a time?
yeah, possibly, yeah. Is without knowing the ins and outs of who can potentially purchase the company. It's very difficult to see one forming, and that's something that I think the governments will have will play a heavy role in terms of forming some kind of consortium, but that's over the medium term. I should imagine that over the short term that it would gain direct control. But there's an issue here with cost and how much liabilities the government is going to take on, and I might ask the question that was put to, I think it was Nigel Farage this morning, about, is there a limit to the cost? Is there a price that's too high for us to take this on a nationalised basis?
And do you think that we'll start seeing government intervening more like this, or do you think that this was a one-off?
That's a good question. I think the process has already started, hasn't it, with the nationalisation of RAL, with Great British Railways. You've already got Great British Energy, but it's not a company that does anything, as far as I can see. It doesn't take direct ownership of the provision of the provision of energy. So the process is already happening. There's already a debate about, do we need to protect certain industries going forward. I think this will fuel the debate about nationalisation. Whether or not Labour will do more of it, not quite sure. It seems reluctant to do this one, it has to be said, presumably because of the cost. But it will certainly give people on the left hope that more can be done.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that, and again, we can talk about how committed reform really is on this agenda, but it's interesting that, both right and left are agreeing on this. I mean, you've got Reform calling for nationalisation, and then you had Jeremy Corbyn standing up and calling for nationalisation. So it is interesting that for the moment at least, kind of left, right, and centre seem to be pretty much agreed on this. So it'll be. It does seem to me that that'll probably end up be what ends up happening,
and that's a good point.
The fact that a relatively short time.
Yeah, that's
have you got any
point. The fact that Reform
thoughts on this?
are doing this. The fact that Reform are calling for this and shouting nationalisation from the rooftops. It's a very interesting development, isn't it? So maybe there's scope. Perhaps that's a sign of things to come. But we'll see.
Well, I mean, just to make a point very quickly, that we've talked before about and again, I wouldn't personally agree with at least part of this, but there does seem to be a space in British politics that would probably be quite popular, where a party is economically on the left but socially on the right. And at the moment, I think that's what the barely continuing SDP claim to be economically left and socially
You
right.
don't
But
like
obviously,
them, do you?
they're such a small party that they're almost not worth kind of talking about. But it'd be interesting to see if Reform does start following
Attacking
that kind of agenda.
And it's very and again it's because Labour keeps telling its lie that they're going to introduce charges to the NHS. They've actually been very strong in terms of saying no, we're still very, very much supporters of the NHS. So it does look like that. I don't know whether they'll do it fully, because a lot of the people there are are very economically liberal, but certainly they're tacking a little bit to the left in economically.
And as you say, just from a purely political standpoint, and in terms of their voters, they do seem to want to appeal to a large section of the working class vote. Now, working class people aren't one homogenous bunch. I'd consider myself working class, and obviously would never consider voting for reform. So, I kind of hate it when a whole group of class of people it's talked about as if they all vote and think the same way. Of course they don't. But I admit there is a large section of the working class electorate that I think would like the idea of much of what reform says. And so obviously from that perspective, it's probably sensible for them to say the things like they were doing yesterday. I just wonder how heartfelt it is, or whether it really is just political positioning. Which, if it is, then okay, all parties do that. But I just wonder how much they really support this agenda.
Well, I mean, we don't know what's really going on in politicians' minds, but they, as I said at the beginning, they do have a better feeling for these things than most of the others, and that's why they're doing very well in the polls at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, Chris, we've come to the end. We've gone past 45 minutes actually, so it's not been a particularly short one, but we're trying to keep it around 45, 50 minutes at the moment. So I think that's been a good discussion on that. No doubt, a lot of these issues we will come back to, because there are issues like water and rail and mail, and these are things that this government and this parliament are going to be having to tackle. And so it's a really interesting time for industry and public services as well. Folks, thanks very much for joining us. Do please go and do all the internety things. I know we say it every week, but we really need you to be doing this. So whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening on one of the podcast platforms, please like, please subscribe, please leave a comment. Nice ones, please. Please tell your friends about us. Please follow us at Frenemies on Twitter. We really need you to do all of that stuff. Our numbers are slowly climbing each week, so we really appreciate that. But yeah, we need you to do all those things, and if you already have, that's great. But please tell someone else about it, and get them to listen to us. It all helps, doesn't it, Chris?
Yeah, please do that. And we are planning to take a week off, aren't we, for the Easter weekend?
Yeah, we absolutely are. Obviously, it's Easter next week, and before we started recording, we did have a bit of debate about whether we should record one next week. But to be honest, I think we could do with a week off. I know we had a long time before we came back again, due to ill health and bereavement, etc. But we think it's not unreasonable for us to have a week off during Easter weekend. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you in a fortnight. no idea what we'll be talking about then. It all depends on the politics of that week, both domestically and internationally. But no doubt that there's no shortage of news, is there, at the moment? Let's face it, we're bombarded with news. So we'll have another big issue, no doubt, to debate. But for the moment, from me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.
See you next time.